Well, are you ready to learn? Then you're in the right place to learn. We have a lot we're going to learn this evening with two outstanding guests. I'm Gleaves Whitney, and on behalf of the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies here at Grand Valley State University, and also on behalf of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library, Museum, and Foundation, delighted to host this evening's event. I think I want to start in an uncharacteristic way. I don't know how many of you happen to watch the Sunday news programs, but I was struck by Congressman Denny Heck of Washington State. He said, I think the quotation of the year, he said, "The Russian probe and impeachment inquiry have rendered his soul weary." And I'd like to think of our Common Ground initiative here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies as a place really of refreshment, an oasis of refreshment and intellectual rigor and integrity. So that's one of the reasons we will continue to host this, I think, in the midst of a political wasteland. The Hauenstein Center has a very generous donor base. Many of you in this audience have been donors and have given. And I just want to say thank you. If you were following the loop before, you certainly saw a number of people and their names. Thank you for that, and I'd also like to recognize some special people here. You know, Grand Rapids is a special community, and that means that Grand Valley has had exceptional leadership. And I'd like to acknowledge President Emeritus Don Lubbers and Mark Murray, President Mark Murray. I see Mark now back there. Yeah, there you go. Great under their leadership, this university thrived. I'd also like to acknowledge the Hauenstein family. I see three of you, Ralph, Carolyn, their son Brian. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your steadfast support. Hauenstein Executive Board here is represented by J.C. Heisinger. J.C., where are you? Thank you so much for being here. Yes, thank you so much. We also have a number of people from the advisory cabinet. Hillary Snell, thanks for your service on the advisory cabinet at the Hauenstein Center, and also so many Leadership Academy mentors. I see Larry Robson, many other of you. Thank you for all the ways you give to these students and to our community. Well, one of the highlights for me at every Common Ground initiative is the opportunity to introduce a person in our Cook Leadership Academy, a fellow candidate. And it's just a privilege to help these students identify their passion and their talents and watch them develop their talents to become leaders and service-oriented individuals here in our country. Each of the 70 leadership candidates in our Cook Leadership Academy are outstanding examples, and you get, if you spend any time around them, you can't help but be optimistic about our country's future. It certainly contrasts with what we read about in the newspaper. Well, I've known Nigel Armstrong for 2 years and have been impressed by his focus, his self-discipline, his ability to grasp the essence of so many of the problems that we have today. He's a senior in the Frederick Myers Honor College here on campus, and he's headed for great things. When he graduates in August, he's going to have his degree in electrical engineering, and then he's going to turn around, go to Washington, and he's going to be commissioned as an officer in the United States Navy. So this evening, Nigel is going to, oh yeah, let's go ahead and give him a hand now. And by the way, in the Navy, he's going to be working with nuclear propulsion. I mean, I'm not even sure I know what that is, but it's pretty sophisticated. Well, this evening, he's going to share with us a lesson that was actually instilled in him by his parents when he was very, very young, and I can't wait to hear what he has to say. Please welcome Nigel to the stage.
Thank you, Gleaves. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nigel Armstrong, and I'm in my second and final year in the Cook Leadership Academy as a fellow candidate. My time at the Cook Leadership Academy has been extraordinary. Looking back, I fondly remember a conversation between Gleaves and myself not too long ago. He and I were grabbing lunch at the Panera Bread in town and having a thought-provoking discussion when the conversation turned to upbringing and parenting. Gleaves told a story about being, in his words, a total loon as he was meeting some of his neighbors. The story reminded me of my parents, the two most supportive people in my life, and how they never took life too seriously. My dad would embarrass my siblings and I every chance he could, as a father should do. And my mom, she still sends me daily videos and pictures of cute dogs just to brighten my day. As leaders, we often face challenges and obstacles every single day. But I have a bit of a new challenge for everyone here this evening. Find a moment in each day that made you smile, laugh, or even embarrass beyond belief. No one will remember that moment like you do, but that is a part of what makes us all unique. So as we take all of the challenges we face as leaders, this new task reminds us to not take ourselves too seriously. My name is Nigel Armstrong, and I'm a leader.
Nigel, you do us proud. You have a great future ahead of you. Thank you for all the service you will be rendering to our country. Well, now for our feature attraction. You know, we got to know Ralph Hauenstein pretty well around here from 2003 till 2016 when he passed. And one of the questions that I heard Ralph field again and again at so many social gatherings was, who was your favorite general in World War II? And without hesitation, Ralph would always say, General George Marshall. And a similar question that would often come up was, who's your favorite statesman? You know, say in the Cold War. And again, Ralph would, without hesitation, say, George Marshall. And, he would add, let's add, Arthur Vandenberg. You have to see them, Ralph would explain, as a team because of the way they structured, they created, they were the architects of the post-Cold War world in which we have lived and enjoyed the stability of that world. So Ralph was keen on these two titans, and it just seemed natural when the opportunity, when Hank Meijer called me up a few months ago and he said, you know, David Roll's on a roll, as it were, with his new book on George Marshall, and I think it would be great to have him in. And I said, well, Hank, I'll do it if you're the interlocutor, if you're the one who interviews him, because I think both of you have this understanding of these two titans and the relationship between them in a way that could be very profitable for our West Michigan audience. I mean, who else in the world than these two men to talk about those two great titans? Now, both Dave and Hank's resume are very long and very distinguished, but let me just give you a couple of highlights to help you appreciate what we're going to be talking about this evening. You can come on up to the front now, please, and take your places so that everybody can see you and anticipate the brain power that is on stage. I promise I won't roast you. Okay. So Dave is on your right, and he has this new book out. You can see out in the exhibition hall, George Marshall, Defender of the Public. Kirkus Reviews calls his work an overdue authoritative biography of one of America's greatest soldier statesmen, a definitive, nuanced portrait. Well, ladies and gentlemen, every word of that characterization is true. As Richard Norton Smith told me earlier today when we were together, Richard said, this biography of George Marshall exceeds all others because, first of all, Dave was able to find new materials in the archive. That always opens up new possibilities. And he was able to go deeper into Marshall's personality and balance it at the same time with all of the professional attainments. So we're going to enjoy, I think, learning some new things about Marshall. Now, Dave is also the author of The Hopkins Touch, Harry Hopkins and the Forging of the Alliance to Defeat Hitler. And he co-authored Lewis Johnson and the Arming of America, a biography of Harry Truman's star-crossed defense secretary. But both of the books earned good reviews. Outside of his published works, David went to the University of Michigan. I think he's telegraphing that to us with his maize and blue tie with about 100 block M's on it. He went to the University of Michigan Law School and subsequently served as senior counsel at the Washington, D.C. firm it's an international law firm, Steptoe and Johnson. He is also the founder of the Lex Mundi Foundation, which serves as a public interest organization that provides pro bono legal services to social entrepreneurs around the world. And it was for these efforts that he was honored by Civic Ventures and recognized by President Barack Obama. Hank Meijer, on your left, needs a little introduction to this audience, as his family name is on many of the rooms and buildings on our campus and throughout our community. But Hank is more than just a recognizable name. He is one of America's great business leaders and social entrepreneurs, and he and his family have made an incalculable impact on the quality of life that we enjoy here in West Michigan and in many other places. He joined the family retail business at age 11 when he was bagging groceries at a Meijer's. Can you believe that? And now he serves as Meijer's executive chairman. In recent years, Hank has emerged as an estimable writer. After honing his skills at the University of Michigan, and as a journalist in Southeast Michigan, and as a biography of his grandfather and namesake, Hendrik Meijer, Hank spent years perfecting his biography of Michigan's greatest 20th century senator, Arthur Vandenberg. Hank, should we tell him how many years? The book, published in 2017 by the University of Chicago Press, has won much praise and is deservedly seen as the definitive biography ever written about Vandenberg. People are amazed to learn that the Grand Rapidian emerged in the 1940s into a kind of co-presidency with Harry Truman after Truman ascended to the White House in April 1945. Well, because of Hank's path-breaking scholarship and excellent writing, I was honored when he accepted my invitation to become an associate at the Hauenstein Center here at Grand Valley. So how fortunate it is for us to have these two outstanding writers. Dave will be channeling, of course, we're going to have George Marshall sitting up here on the left, and Hank on the right will be channeling and, in a sense, being, I think, Arthur Vandenberg. Ladies and gentlemen, thank them.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Gleaves. And it's easy to write the definitive biography when it's the only biography. But when I was writing it, my elevator pitch was that Arthur Vandenberg was the most important public figure of the 20th century in the U.S. whose story had not been told. And David Rohl has taken on a far bigger challenge to tell the story of someone whose life has been written of often and at length by a train of distinguished historians, a challenge I would find completely intimidating. But while George Marshall's name lives on in connection with the Marshall Plan, that great triumph of American diplomacy after World War II, the memory of the man himself is not so vivid. And it really never was until now, because so much has been written about Marshall, but it will always, I have this image of this Sphinx-like character who has this stoic sense of sacrifice and patriotic duty. And that's why when it came to David's book, the Wall Street Journal praised him for finding Marshall's inner voice and saying that his book is a powerful antidote to a Twitter-glutted era when political cynicism has reached its nadir and civic virtue has become a punchline. And so it's appropriate that we're here tonight. Mr. Rohl's Marshall is a testament to the lasting power of integrity and the sort of trust we hunger for in our public life. And to think it all started, David, you had an idea for a smaller book about Marshall and his leadership traits. And what attracted you to George Marshall?
Well, the two previous books. The last book I wrote was about Harry Hopkins, who was Roosevelt's closest personal aide during World War II, who lived in the White House for 3.5 years. And Marshall, of course, was chief of staff of the entire United States Army throughout World War II. And he did not want to get too close to President Franklin Roosevelt. He wanted to be completely on a business relationship. He didn't want to get seduced, as so many were, by Roosevelt's amazing charm and attraction as personality. So he used Harry Hopkins as his window into Roosevelt's, what Robert Sherwood called his heavily forested interior. Great phrase, describing Roosevelt's mind that worked in such mysterious ways at times. So Marshall, but then Marshall and Harry Hopkins, there couldn't be two more different characters, became friends when they were making these long trips to England to visit with Churchill and so forth. And so Marshall became dependent upon Hopkins for interpreting what was going on in Roosevelt's mind. So that attracted me. And then, of course, the first book I co-authored with a historian bookended Marshall's career My subject was Lewis Johnson, who founded my law firm in Washington, Steptoe and Johnson. And I got interested in him, but I ran into this historian, and so we ended up working together on the book. But Johnson was Assistant Secretary of War under Roosevelt, 1938, and he took credit for a lot of stuff. Took credit for getting Marshall appointed Army Chief of Staff in 1939. And then later on, when Marshall, Johnson was appointed Secretary of Defense under Truman. Johnson was a lawyer politician, helped Truman win the election in 1948. So he became Secretary of Defense when the Korean War broke out. And at that point, Truman had enough of Lewis Johnson's overbearing attitude. And Johnson was trying to push Atchison out of the way as Secretary of State. So anyway, Truman wanted to fire Louis Johnson. And in his place, he asked Marshall to become Secretary of Defense. So Lewis Johnson appeared at the beginning and the end of Marshall's public career. So I got to know a lot about Marshall, and I admired him. Everything I saw about him, I admired. So taking him on was a big challenge, and I have to apologize for the weight and the size of the book, because I started out with a much more limited kind of treatment, but the editors and the agents said, do the whole deal, or most of the whole deal, so that's what I did. Yeah.
Well, and before we get further, I think there is another Michigan connection. Was it when he was actually appointed Secretary of Defense that he was vacationing in the Upper Peninsula?
No, here's what happened. Actually, when Truman approached Marshall on the 4th of July, 1950, actually, 4th of July is very quiet at the White House in 1950, but the Korean War had just broke out, and the U.S. forces were pinned down in the southern end of South Korea. It was touch and go. And Truman drove out. He had Margaret's daughter drove him. He didn't tell anybody where he was going on 4th of July, but they went out to Marshall's house in Leesburg, Virginia, and they had lunch under the oaks outside that house. And that's when Truman said, I'm going to fire Louis Johnson. He's gotten over his skis. And will you be ready when I'm ready to appoint you Secretary of Defense? And Marshall, as he always did when a president asked him to do anything, said, yes, Mr. President, I'll be ready. But that summer of 1950, Truman, delayed firing Johnson. So Marshall went up to the Huron Mountain Club. Huron Mountain Club, which I knew nothing about, except I knew vaguely of it. I knew that Henry Ford was a member, and I knew that it was a lot of the industrialists throughout the Midwest that had this huge piece of property up on the northern peninsula, on the Upper Peninsula on Lake Superior. Well, I think it was late August. Marshall loved to fish, hunt, and he was living up there with another retired general. I found a guy in my research who was there when he was 8 years old, told me everything about where Marshall was staying. And one day, a phone call, there was no phone lines into the Huron Mountain Club, so a phone call came to the little town where they filmed, it's Big Bay, Michigan, where they filmed Anatomy of a Murder later on. But a phone call came into that little town, and all the locals gathered around. It was the president. President Truman was calling for Marshall. Well, it took Marshall about a half an hour to get out of Huron Mountain, several miles, and to come to that phone. And it was like the biggest moment ever in Big Bay before the filming. And they all crowded around, and that's when Truman said, when are you coming back? And Marshall said, Mr. President, I'll be back as soon as you want me back. He said, well, take another week, but report to me when you get back. He appointed Marshall Secretary of Defense, And just like Mattis, recently, the law had to be changed because he was barred from being Secretary of Defense because he had been in the military. So he was, just like Mattis, they had to pass a special law, but they did that in 20 minutes, and he was appointed Secretary of Defense. And in that job, he helped rebuild the American armed forces that had been depleted following the Second World War, and they needed that. They put on a draft. They needed a lot of new troops to fight the Korean War. And then Marshall, probably his most publicized contribution during that time was overseeing with considerable and surprising reluctance the firing, the relief of General Douglas MacArthur, which was a huge political thing that took place in late 1950.
And relied a little bit on Senator Vandenberg's nephew, Hoyt, as his eyes and ears.
Exactly,
make that
Hoyt
decision.
Vandenberg, yeah, that's right.
But to go back to World War II, one of the things that I think you address very well is how Marshall was willing to speak truth to power, and somehow he survived and flourished in his jobs with a kind of frankness that won people's respect, even as it would have gone against the grain of a lot of political interests. You might talk a little about some of those examples.
Yeah, three quick key moments in his career. 1917, Marshall by then was I think a major in the Army. He was in the 1st Division, the Big Red One, famous division. The 1st Division was the first division that arrived in France in World War I after we declared war in April 1917. And Pershing was in charge of all of the soldiers, the American soldiers in France. Pershing was pressuring the Big Red One, the 1st Division, to get trained, and because he was being pressured by Pershing was being pressured by the English and the French to get into the war, because the French and the English had been fighting the war for 4 years. They were exhausted. They needed the American troops. They were at the limit of their resources. So the pressure was on, and they were training somewhere in France. Pershing arrived to see the maneuvers by the 1st Division. Marshall greeted him at the train because the division in charge, the 1st Division general wasn't there. They did the maneuvers, and Pershing had it in already for the general in charge of the 1st Division. So in front of all of the officers, Pershing ripped the general in charge of the 1st Division up and down for not having his troops in sufficient training condition. And Marshall stepped out of the crowd of officers in front of everyone and said, "Wait a minute, General Pershing, there's something to say. I've been here the longest, and I have something to say to you about this situation." And then he just had this fuselage of factual incidents in which he blamed Pershing's own headquarters for not supplying them on time, for giving them conflicting orders, for basically screwing things up, and in front of everybody. And Pershing said, well, he wanted to get out of there. He said, well, I'll look into it. And he asked one of his aides to write it down. And Marshall then grabbed him by his sleeve, said, "No, there's nothing to look into. I've just given you the facts, and those are the facts." And at that point, Pershing said, "I had enough." But instead of, all his friends said, "You're done. That's it." But instead, Pershing actually appreciated constructive criticism. He thought about it, and it was constructive, and he did check into things at his headquarters. And so he saw Marshall as someone to be reckoned with, someone to be developed, someone to become, to be, lifted up into the ranks. So Marshall planned one combat. The 2 regiments of the 1st Division took on the first American offensive, and Marshall planned that whole thing, and was under fire during that. But that was the last time he was under fire in combat, because Pershing pulled him out and took him to headquarters, where he planned a brilliant plan for the final battle that ended the First World War, the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So Pershing made him his personal aide right after the war. So right after the war, Marshall was inside the White House with Pershing, and while Pershing was off in France with his mistress, Marshall basically ran the army while Pershing was away. So,
Well, then
yeah. Another incident, in 1938, cabinet room, White House. Roosevelt's president. Marshall is still, he's a general, but first star maybe. He's in the alcove in the back of the room. The cabinet room is filled with the cabinet, all of the top military officers at the time. And Roosevelt is wheeled in. They didn't have any photographers there like they do now with Trump's cabinet meeting. But in any event, Roosevelt announced a plan to deter Hitler. He said, we're going to produce 10,000 warplanes. That's what we need to do. He didn't say it, but what he really wanted to do was sell them to the British and the French, and basically use our productive power to deter Hitler in Europe. Went around the room, everybody said, yes, this is a great idea, let's do it. You know, nobody dissented except Roosevelt called upon Marshall. Well, George, what do you think about that? And Marshall was somewhat offended by his use of the first name because he only liked people that were close to him to call him by his first name. And he got up and said, Mr. President, I don't agree with that at all. And it shocked. Roosevelt was pushed back. He was astounded by someone who would a junior officer who would stand up and do that. So but by Christmas, Hopkins was meeting with Marshall, questioning him about his capability for being Army Chief of Staff. And by April of 1939, Marshall found himself in the White House, being interviewed by the President for the Army Chief of Staff job. Told him then, I'm going to be speaking unpleasantly. You've got to get used to it. I'm going to tell you the truth, no matter what it means, and I'm going to tell you the raw truth. It's not going to be pleasant. Nevertheless, Marshall appointed him Chief of Staff the day that the European War broke out, the Second World War broke out in Europe. So for the next 6 years, Marshall was Army Chief of Staff. And there were lots of conversations between Marshall and the President, or through Hopkins, that weren't particularly pleasant. He spoke truth to power, and Roosevelt respected that.
And it wasn't only Roosevelt, because in the early months of the war, Roosevelt had never been particularly interested in communicating with Congress anyway, and particularly if you were a Republican like Vandenberg, he would say this is Roosevelt's private war. He's not keeping us informed. And then in early 1942, or after the invasion of North Africa, when the Allies are finally beginning to the Americans are engaging in offensive action, Marshall goes to Capitol Hill, and Vandenberg, I was just looking back through my book, said Marshall had turned on the light. He was sharing some of the background of the strategy that the Allies were taking that Roosevelt had never deigned to do. And he also spoke a year later after the Casablanca conference and said, again went back to the Foreign Relations Committee, and Vandenberg said he made us a little uneasy because we realized that sometimes the British were outwitting us in some of the negotiations about what the strategy should be. But that frankness put him in good stead on Capitol Hill when it came time a few years later for the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan.
Right. So, Sam Rayburn used to say, who was the famous Speaker of the House, that he told the truth even when it was against his interests. So he had a reputation, and that reputation carried through when he was Secretary of State. I'm telling you the truth. And he gave them a lot of inside information. He trusted them. So he had a great relationship with both houses of Congress. you know, I remember one time he was meeting with the Republicans to convince them of something or other. They had this meeting at the Army-Navy Club, and one of the congressmen said, you know, I guess he was trying to get them to appropriate more money. Usually that's what it was. And one of the congressmen said, I'll be damned, you know, if I'm going to do anything that Roosevelt wants to have done. And at that point, you know, Marshall admonished him and said, you know, this is not about personalities. This is not about politics. This is about the national interest, the national security. And they listened to that.
Well, and then when Truman succeeds Roosevelt and it comes time to aid the reconstruction of the devastated economies of Europe, Truman instinctively knew that he wasn't going to go to Congress and say, you know, do what Truman wants done. He sent Marshall.
So after Marshall announced the outlines of the Marshall Plan at a speech at Harvard in June of 1947, he was Secretary of State at the time. Truman's personal advisor, Clark Clifford, and at the time the Marshall Plan was not called the Marshall Plan, it was called the European Recovery Program. And so they wanted to have a massive financial grant to countries in Europe to help them revive after the Second World War. So it was called the European Recovery Program. But Truman's advisor, Clark Clifford, recommended that the plan be called the Truman Plan. And at the time, Truman's approval numbers were in the tank. And Truman responded, as he did in his Midwestern way, if I send that plan up to the Hill with my name on it, we'll quiver a couple of times, go belly up, and die. Even the worst Republican, he said, will vote for the plan if Marshall's name is attached to it. And he was dead right. By that time, Marshall was the most respected public figure in America. The Marshall Plan.
And in fact, we want to go to questions here in just a moment. So I have to, it may not come up in a question, but I have to say that when Vandenberg was bedridden and dying of cancer in 1950, Marshall sent him a letter and talked about what had been accomplished both with Marshall and Vandenberg working together in secret meetings at Blair House down the street from the White House to work out how to sell the Marshall Plan to Congress. And then when NATO came along and Marshall would dispatch his undersecretary, Bob Lovett, to go to Vandenberg's apartment, and they did the Vandenberg Resolution, which enabled American participation in what would become NATO. And so Marshall's reflecting on that and writes to Vandenberg and said, it would have been a great relaxer to sit down and have a drink with you and Bob Lovett and decide just how we were going to manage the world and then have done it. And Vandenberg writes back and says, those were truly great days. My part in them will always be my proudest record. Looking backward, it really is quite amazing how we and the world got along together. And that partnership.
Yeah, let me say, one thing just came into mind. When Marshall accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 1953, that was the end of his public career. And when he got on the boat, he was not, his health wasn't great at that time. So he decided to take the boat. And when the reporters were interviewing him as he left to go accept the Nobel Peace Prize, he said, and it was reported that Vandenberg really should, and by this time Vandenberg had died of lung cancer, right? And he said that Vandenberg deserves this award. That's what he thought about Vandenberg. And just the relationship between Vandenberg and Marshall, at least in my view, and you know more about it than I do, but I thought it began when they were at this Rio de Janeiro conference of the South American states to work out really the forerunner of NATO for South America. And they were at this conference up in the mountains above Rio, and Marshall was Secretary of State, and Vandenberg was there. You know, this was when he was chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee as a Republican. The Republicans took over the Senate in 1946. So it was totally and this is when the wives were together, Hazel and Arthur Vandenberg and Marshall's wife Catherine, and they came upon the Marshalls playing Chinese checkers with each other. They learned how to play Chinese checkers in China, and they became friends. That was the time when the two couples formed a relationship. And I think Hazel said they were a grand couple,
yes.
Something like that.
And he allowed Vandenberg to call him George.
Yep, and it was Van and George.
That's
it was
right.
Van and George. And that was a big breakthrough. It was always Van and George. And Hazel just thought that Marshall was congenial, a gentleman, had a sense of humor. And not a lot of people said Marshall had a sense of humor.
Well, and you captured that in the book in a way that
Yeah.
previous biographers had not. And perhaps we should see if we can talk amongst ourselves as an audience. If you have some questions, I'm sure David would love to reflect on them.
No?
Tom? Yep.
David, will you expound on the relationship?
Where are you? There you are.
Come over here.
Oh.
Will you expound on the relationship between General Marshall and Dwight David Eisenhower?
Sure. So it begins like many other relationships. They met in 1930, not briefly, because they were both called upon by Pershing to help him write his memoirs. But, you know, Marshall had an eye on Eisenhower. Eisenhower actually was working for MacArthur in the Philippines in the middle 30s. It was, you know, he really didn't like it, working under MacArthur, but he was a brilliant officer. So right after Pearl Harbor, you know, early December 1941, the first big personnel move that Marshall made was he called upon General Eisenhower, who at that point was maybe a one-star general, who was out in Kansas somewhere, out in the Midwest. Get back, you know, hop on a plane. That was the order. Hop on a plane and get to Washington. And so within 2 days, Eisenhower was in Marshall's office, and Eisenhower wrote that Marshall gave him the cold eye, and it was all business. And basically, it was master-servant at this point. And basically said to Eisenhower, and he always called him Eisenhower, never called him Ike. Eisenhower, we need a plan for the Pacific, the grand strategy for the Pacific, and what are we going to do about MacArthur in the Philippines? MacArthur was trapped, surrounded by the Japanese. And Eisenhower said, give me 2 minutes. Or I'm 2 hours, not 2 minutes, 2 hours. It wasn't that good. 2 hours, even that. And that's when Marshall made one of his statements about his generals. You know, I have lots of generals, and I ask them to do lots of things, come up with solutions, and that's what I want my generals to do: come up with solutions. And so I want you to tell me what I need to do, and just tell me what it is, and if I approve, we'll do it. But I just don't want to have. I don't want to end up making these decisions. So Eisenhower did come back with a plan, which was a grand strategy for defending the Pacific, while we concentrated on Germany first. And this was we decided at the very beginning of the war that we weren't going to put all our resources in the Pacific. We were really, at the beginning, we said we're going to go on the defensive in the Pacific. We're going to try to rescue MacArthur and his troops on the Bataan Peninsula. We'll do what we can, but we're going to concentrate on Germany first. So that was when he first met with Eisenhower. Then, when Eisenhower became Marshall basically appointed him commander of the invasion and the troops in North Africa. He gave Eisenhower a long leash, gave him a lot of responsibility. Eisenhower made many mistakes, but he backed him. He counseled him on one of his biggest mistakes, appointing Darlan, the interim, one of the Nazi collaborators, ended up being in charge of North Africa for a while, one of the North African agents for a while. It was a big mistake. But Marshall backed him and showed his loyalty to Eisenhower. Eisenhower, in turn, showed his loyalty to Marshall. So it became mentor-mentee, and then it became more of a partnership. I call it a management partnership, where Eisenhower was, the managing director in the field, and Marshall was backing him up at home, and then it became even a solicitous. Eisenhower gained more and more equity and voting power in that relationship. So by the time of the Overlord command decision, they were almost equal partners. And I told that story about the Alibi Club. I'll tell it just briefly. Right before Overlord was June of '44. That was the invasion of northern France, or northwest France. Massive invasion. It was the most, the biggest battle that the Americans and the British would fight. But Eisenhower was supreme commander of Overlord. In January of '44, Marshall insisted that Eisenhower return to the United States. There were rumors afloat about his relationship with the driver, Kay Summersby, in North Africa, and rumors about his marriage with Mamie. And so that was one reason why Marshall insisted he come back. But he also wanted to spend some time with him, to counsel him before he took on this amazing responsibility, this risky, this gamble. So Eisenhower said, "No, I can't. I got too much to do. I've got to get to England and organize." He said, "No, you're coming back." So he came back, disguised, wearing, they didn't want the Germans to know. And so he did spend time with Mamie. He spent a lot of time over at the Pentagon being counseled, advised, what do you need, what various, they set up the relationship. But then there was this night, January 1944, when they had this amazing gathering at the Alibi Club, this club of 50 members in Washington that has existed since the 1880s. And during the war, Marshall used that as a place to have very top secret meetings with his commanders. But that night, he brought Eisenhower to meet with the congressional leaders, both parties, the movers and shakers in Congress, some of the top cabinet officers. Stimson was there, and many of the top people in Washington. And it was Marshall's way of introducing Eisenhower to Washington power. So I call him the solicitous father figure. And so they came into this dark, kind of shabby club that still exists in Washington amid the 10-story skyscraper. That's our skyscrapers in Washington. This club, and they had this amazing evening in which Eisenhower charmed the heck out of everybody, and Marshall made sure he did. And they had some generals in from the Pacific who talked about what was going on out there. And it was his way of cementing relationships, because they didn't know whether Overlord was going to work, or whether we'd have to call it off, or whether Churchill would have second thoughts. And so it was in my view, just a key event, and it's the kind of thing that Marshall did for Eisenhower. That's a long way of talking about it. Sorry.
That's a good answer.
Yeah.
Yes. Another question. Yes.
What can you tell us about Marshall's parents' childhood that led to the person he became?
You know, I've been criticized for not dealing enough with that. And there's certain places where I had to sort of, what am I going to do? Am I going to go really back to his ancestry, his parents, and so forth? I touched on it lightly, and, you know, I think it turns out his father was a gregarious businessman. It was up and down. They lived in Uniontown, just across the Mason-Dixon line on the north. Uniontown was a booming little town on the old National Road that went into Ohio. And his father was up and down in the coal and coke industry. He made a lot of money, and then he invested in those caverns, the Luray caverns, with hotels and developments, and he went bankrupt. So they were up and down. His mother was the daughter of a physician, an abolitionist physician. So he didn't have, you know, his father taught him to hunt and fish. You know, he had a decent relationship with his father, but it wasn't a big relationship in his wife. And I think they had a distance after a while. But the main influence on him was his brother. His older brother went to the VMI, the Virginia Military Institute, 6 years ahead of Marshall, and he overheard his brother one night telling his mother that George, young George, his nickname was Flicker, which denoted sort of a fecklessness. You know, he was running, you know, he was a flickering kind of guy he's always playing off, not a serious character. But his brother said, Flicker should not go to the Virginia Military Institute. It will disgrace his family. He overheard that, told that story much later in life. And he was offended. And also, when he was at VMI, turns out that his older brother had dated the woman that Marshall, his first wife, and he made some derogatory comments about her. I don't know exactly what they were, but Marshall remembered them. And basically, after a few years, Marshall cut him off. He wouldn't have anything to do with his older brother. His father moved out to the state of Washington. He had very little relationship. He had a great relationship with his sister, Marie. She stuck with him through his first wife's death and was always with him. So I don't see his parents having much of a effect on his character. Obviously, they must have, but I didn't deal with it a lot. You know, McCullough, when he wrote about Truman, went way, way back into his background and found influences. I chose not to spend much time on it.
Question up here.
Who made the decision that Eisenhower go to the ETO, Marshall or the president, and what was behind it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think it was December 5, 1943, Marshall was with Eisenhower in Cairo. They were already there together, and Roosevelt had just gotten back from the Tehran conference in which Stalin said, "Who's going to command Overlord?" And Roosevelt turned to an aide that was sitting next to him and whispered, "That old Bolshevik is trying to press me on who I'm going to appoint commander." But Stalin really said, unless you appoint somebody in charge of this invasion, which is supposed to take place in June of '44, nothing's going to happen. And Roosevelt had been dithering about what to do. But anyway, in December 5, 1943, he called Marshall in to his villa, and he said, he asked Marshall whether he wished to command Overlord, whether he wanted to command Overlord. Now, Marshall knew, because of his stature, that if he asked for the command, Roosevelt would almost certainly give it to him. but he didn't ask. He demurred. And instead, he told the president that he should decide the matter of who should command Overlord according to the best interest of the country. And he should not consider his, that is, Marshall's own feelings. And so, as a result of that, Roosevelt concluded the affair, and he said, well, I could not sleep at ease with you out of Washington. Marshall had been his mainstay in Washington, which meant that Dwight Eisenhower would get the command, and that would be his springboard to the presidency. Now, whether Marshall coveted the command of Overlord, and some of his closest associates, Stimson, thought he did, or whether he really thought it was in the best interest for him to remain in Washington, where he controlled the Joint Chiefs and he could influence the course of the global war, whether or not, and we'll never know the truth, because there's no document. There's just what people thought. But his refusal to express his desire, one way or the other, in my judgment, was utterly selfless. And it was the moral code that I believe, and I wrote a lot about his character. It was the moral code that he lived by. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, who was a lifelong Presbyterian, found an apt proverb to express Marshall's character and his selflessness. He that ruleth his own spirit, he said, is better than he that taketh a city. And that was Marshall's character. And that was one of the two themes that run throughout my book, is character and inner life. Now, why did Roosevelt decide not to give him the command? There are a number of reasons. Number one was, let's not monkey with let's not monkey with the situation the way it is now, with Marshall in Washington, running the Joint Chiefs, dominating the grand strategy. Let's not monkey with that. Eisenhower's done a decent job in North Africa. He's grown. He's matured. He can do it. A second reason is that there was lobbying going back, lobbying in Washington by the Joint Chiefs. The Joint Chiefs did not want Marshall to leave Washington because he was holding them together, particularly with Admiral King. Who could deal with Admiral King other than Marshall? Not many people. And King himself was doing the lobbying. King wanted Marshall to stay in Washington. So that was going on. And then they were leaking to the press that if Marshall went to command Overlord, it would be a demotion. You know, here he was directing the whole war. Now you want to send him to London to run this invasion. That would be a demotion. And then the third reason is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was perfectly happy to have Marshall go to Overlord. But he did not want Marshall to become supreme commander of all of Europe. Churchill wanted to reserve the Mediterranean for himself. And Roosevelt said, the only way I can send Marshall to do Overlord, he's got to have command of all of Europe. And Churchill put his foot down. He said, no way, we're going to do the Mediterranean. Churchill always wanted to go up through the Balkans. And that was, so anyway, so it was those combination of reasons which led Roosevelt to give the command to Eisenhower. And that's why he became president.
There's a question here. Yep.
This is for you, Henrik. Vandenberg in the late 30s questioned the Lend-Lease program when he said when you have two belligerents and you accommodate one, you make an enemy of another. You want to talk about that?
That was at the height of Vandenberg's commitment to the idea of American neutrality, and he saw that as he said we have to distinguish between our head and our heart. And in our hearts, we might want to begin to come to the aid of the British because war might be imminent. But in our heads, we want to adhere to his hero Hamilton's words of advice in the famous farewell address of Washington to avoid foreign entanglements. And he said, you know, once you come to the support of one, you've taken sides, and that's going to get us into the war. And so we have to maintain absolute neutrality. And that was coupled with his continuous suspicion that Roosevelt was maneuvering to bring us closer to war. And he distrusted Roosevelt so intensely that he wouldn't allow that anything. And clearly Roosevelt had designs to get us into the war. So if we get a little bit committed with something like Lend-Lease, we're on our way in.
Right.
And he was unwilling to go there.
Yeah, and the strategists, Admiral Stark, who really set the overall grand strategy, and Marshall adopted it, was Germany first, and we had to make sure that Britain was not overrun by the Nazis, because if they were overrun, we really were in the soup in terms of an attack on the Western Hemisphere. It was getting that island that was really key in terms of the strategists. We had to protect that island.
And Vandenberg was resisting that.
What? Yeah.
It was resisting that wisdom.
Right.
Yes, John.
I do financial planning for a living, and I have about a half a dozen clients who are, they're young, they were young gals at the time, but they married American GIs, and it's kind of interesting to hear some of their stories. One of them met Adolf Hitler in a town square in Austria. Another one was telling me, kind of tied to the Marshall Plan, how, there was just utter destruction in Germany, and how they formed lines to fill buckets of rubble and pass them along the lines. And a third lady was telling me how every time she hears like a 4th of July explosion, she just kind of cringes, from the bombing that happened then. And I just wondered if you could comment on just the Marshall Plan, what years that took place?
Sure.
How much money that was involved?
Right.
Was it just United States money? And what it all accomplished?
Yeah, it's a great story. It began at the foreign ministers meeting in Moscow. This was Marshall's first major appearance as Secretary of State. It was 1947, in the early 1947. And Marshall had a meeting with Joseph Stalin. And the question was, what are we going to do about the utter destruction in Western Europe, starting with all of Germany and going westward? And Stalin said, don't get excited. Let's take our time. We don't have to worry about this. We'll have another meeting. We'll have another foreign ministers meeting. They hadn't solved anything at the foreign ministers meeting about what they were going to do. And Marshall came back from that meeting convinced that Stalin didn't want to do anything about Germany particularly. That having utter destruction across the continent of Europe was in his favor. The communists could gain ground, could continue to move westward from the Eastern European countries where they already were dominant because the Red Army was there. So he came back from that conference and said, we've got to do something. We have to figure out a way to restore West Germany. And so he brought in George Kennan, who was a brilliant analyst of the mind of the Soviets, the mind of Stalin, the mind of the Russian history. And Kennan had written this long telegram that if you read it today, it's almost like this is Russia. This is Soviet. He analyzed how they behave in the culture, the DNA. In any event, he brought in Kennan to come up with a plan. And this is the forerunner of the Marshall Plan. Then he brought in some brilliant people, Atchison, Bob Lovett, this guy, Will Clayton, who was he was the richest and most prominent cotton trader in the world. It was the Anderson Clayton firm that still exists today. It came out of Memphis. But he was working for the government at $1 a year, Will Clayton, and he was brought in to help shape the Marshall Plan, with the recovery of Western Europe. And it became a trade deal, in part. It was not wholly altruistic. But what happened was, with Vandenberg's help, they pushed through some legislation that basically contemplated spending $13 billion over a period of 4 years. $13 billion then is, I think, $800 billion today. But basically, it was to spend a whole lot of money. But the key to the Marshall Plan was and this was 1947 and 1948. This was when it was happening. We had a bipartisan Congress. I mean, the Republicans were controlling both houses of Congress at that time. So we had a Democratic administration and a Republican Congress. The idea was to provide the money, but the European nations, after 500 years of fighting among themselves, had to come together. Not the Eastern European nations, but France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the UK, the Western European nations had to come together and for the first time come up with an integrated plan. It was the forerunner of the common market, the forerunner of the European Union. So the genius in the thing was, you guys come up with the plan, but and if we approve the plan, we'll give you the money. But then of course they tinkered with what the Europeans came up with. That was the idea. You come up with a plan. It was integrating Europe for the first time in a way. And so with Vandenberg's help, they got the legislation through. And Vandenberg shaped the strategy of the legislation. He was a genius once he got his hands on it to figure out how best to get it through Congress. So throughout 1948, the legislative process ground, and Marshall led off. He was the kickoff witness for the Senate. And he was very blunt. He said, this is going to cost the taxpayers a lot of money. It's going to be a risk. He said, I'm not sure it's going to work. But it's the best thing we can possibly do. It's a gamble. And he said it's going to be a sacrifice for the Americans. He said those things, but he convinced the Congress to pass this thing. And Vandenberg made an amazing speech in March of 1948. He was so eloquent. You remember that, March 1, 1948. And that was when it went to the floor of the Senate. And, the Senate passed it overwhelmingly. And then it went to the House, and we had some problems there. And then they had to have the appropriation. So it wasn't until, June of 48 that the whole thing got passed. And now, economists have debated whether they really needed the Marshall Plan to revive their economies, or whether it would have happened anyway. And so I dealt with that debate in my book and concluded that the main thing was psychological. Mm-hmm. The fact that the Europeans knew that we were there and we were going to give them the money. And we needed those export markets. This was not altruistic. We needed Germany, particularly. And that was a big fight because the French were very afraid of a revival of Germany. So that's what happened. In 2 chapters of the book, and you wrote all about it.
Well, Vandenberg's mantra was enlightened self-interest, and I think that describes how he sold the Marshall Plan.
Right.
And then, of course, the administration proposed a multi-year program for those billions of dollars, and he said, no, we aren't going to take on something that big. So they came back with 15 months, and he said, no, 12 months. And then hired the Brookings Institution to come say, how should this be run? Because Truman said, well, we'll put Dean Acheson in charge of it.
No way.
And all of a sudden, now you're going to have a Democratic administration with a Democratic bureaucrat running this under the auspices of the State Department. And Vandenberg said, no, 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 and got a fellow named Paul Hoffman, who was the president of Studebaker Motors, to come in and administer the program independently, reporting to the president. And that whole structure was something that he could sell to
And
the Congress.
Vandenberg convinced Hoffman to come.
Yeah.
He didn't want to do it.
Well, wasn't it also Marshall's genius that, obviously this was Western Europe, but he was willing to take the gamble to invite the Russians and Eastern Europeans?
Kennan said, you got to offer this plan to the Soviets and all the Eastern European countries that were under the domination of Stalin. And Marshall said, yeah, but what if they accept? Kennan knew, he said, they'll never accept it. Stalin will never let anybody take a look at their economy. And then, of course, the Czechs wanted it. And the Czechs actually, for a time, wanted to take advantage of that plan, and Stalin quashed it. So all the all the Eastern European countries stayed with Stalin under his thumb. So it was, you know, the other thing that had to follow from it, which is where we are in the world today. Not only did we, you know, help restore the Western Europe, we started their whole integration, led to the European Union and so forth. But also, the French and the British and the Western European countries said, you know, we need security. You know, if we're going to be able to revive our economies, we have to not be under the thumb of Stalin. We need to defend ourselves against, and that's when we said, all right, it's going to have to be NATO. So that was the beginning. So right following on the Marshall Plan, a complement to the Marshall Plan, a necessary complement, was NATO. And that was when that began. Marshall was there for the beginning of that. Vandenberg was there for when it was finally put together in 1949. So this was the beginning of the world order that we have today, and which is under assault in certain respects in terms of the NATO alliance today.
I think we might have time for one more question. She's asking about the influence of General de Gaulle and his objections to having England as a part of the EU and how that affected the Marshall Plan debate.
Yeah, I don't know much about that, actually. I'll be honest. You know, de Gaulle was obviously the most difficult character you know, in Western Europe for anybody to deal with. You know, and I don't think Marshall. I don't remember Marshall ever having much of a relationship or any dealings with de Gaulle. I know that you know, Churchill was, you know, Churchill had to deal with him.
And Eisenhower had to deal with it.
Yeah, that's right. Did Vandenberg have a? You know,
No, they didn't.
I don't know about that.
So I just, as we close up, you talk about NATO and the implications for today. What do we take away from General Marshall's life that's most inspirational for us now? Well,
character, selflessness, self-mastery, magnanimity. He was magnanimous in terms of what. You know, there was an incident when Truman was about to undermine him by sending an envoy to Moscow to negotiate directly with Stalin, and at the time, Marshall was in Paris, locked in negotiations with the Soviets. Found out about it, and his advisor said, you know, you should resign or threaten to resign over. He's undermining, and Marshall thought about the pressures that were on Truman, on the president, as he was running in that 1948 for the presidency. And he dashed off a message to Truman. Said, I understand what's worrying you, Mr. President, and I'm flying home immediately. And this was magnanimity on a grand scale. And in my judgment, it was the mark of his greatness. You know, they say that to test a man's power to test a man's character, give him power. Well, in my view, by gaining dominion over most but not all of his shortcomings, Marshall had some shortcomings, but by gaining dominion, by self-mastery, by any measure, Marshall surely passed that test.
David, thank you very much. This has been a treat.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, all right. Thank you. All right, yeah.